Welcome to Horrific Stories, where real-life terror awaits. Subscribe if you dare. Tonight's tale will haunt you. Tonight's chilling story comes from the streets, where the homeless face unspeakable horrors. What if what they encounter isn't human? The Man Beneath the Bridge. It was a cold, windy night in the city, where the sounds of honking cars and distant chatter had long faded into the void. For the homeless, nights like these are the worst, lonely and freezing. Marcus had been living on the streets for nearly 2 years now, having lost everything. His job, his home, and the family he once held dear. He had seen a lot, but nothing could have prepared him for the night he spent under the old, crumbling bridge on the outskirts of the city. Everyone knew that bridge was different. Other homeless people avoided it like the plague. Rumors floated around, whispers of something lurking beneath, waiting for unsuspecting victims who had nowhere else to go. But Marcus, desperate for shelter, didn't care about old urban legends. He found a quiet corner underneath the bridge, tucked himself into his sleeping bag, and prepared for another sleepless night. As the night deepened, an unsettling feeling began to creep over him. It wasn't just the cold that made his skin prickle. It was something else, something watching him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as a soft rustling noise came from the shadows behind him. He turned sharply, his heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the wind, he told himself. But the rustling grew louder, more deliberate. It was like something, or someone, was dragging itself across the concrete. Marcus squinted into the darkness, his breath visible in the cold air. That's when he saw it. A figure, pale, gaunt, and impossibly thin, emerged from the shadows. Its skin hung loosely from its bones, and its eyes. Those eyes, they were hollow, sunken deep into its skull. It wasn't walking toward him. No, it was crawling, dragging its body in slow, agonizing movements. Its lips stretched into a grotesque smile, revealing sharp, broken teeth. Marcus froze in terror, his mind racing for an escape, but his legs refused to move. The thing crawled closer, its long fingers scraping against the ground, leaving behind a sickening trail of something wet and dark. Suddenly it stopped, lifting its head to sniff the air like a wild animal that had just caught the scent of prey. Marcus realized too late what was happening. The creature's head snapped in his direction, locking eyes with him. In that moment, he knew it had been waiting, not just for anyone, but for him. Panic surged through his body, and Marcus scrambled to his feet. He didn't care where he ran as long as it was far away from that bridge. He sprinted into the night, but the sound of the thing following him never faded. Its nails clicked against the pavement, faster and faster, closing the distance between them. Marcus didn't stop running until he reached the heart of the city. Breathless and trembling, he collapsed near a convenience store, hoping someone, anyone, would be around. But the streets were empty. Later, when the police found him, he was incoherent, babbling about the creature beneath the bridge. They dismissed him as another unstable homeless man, just another ghost of the streets. But Marcus knew what he saw. The thing under the bridge was real, and it was still out there, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to wander into its lair. So, next time you pass by a homeless person sitting alone in the dark, remember this story. Some places, some shadows are best left undisturbed. You never know what might be lurking, waiting to crawl out from the darkness. The woman in the alley nights in the city are filled with eerie echoes, stray dogs barking in the distance, the hum of traffic fading in and out, and sometimes, just sometimes, the quiet sobs of those left behind. But tonight, the city felt different. It wasn't just the usual urban gloom. Something malevolent hung in the air, clinging to every alleyway and empty street. James was no stranger to these streets. Homeless for over 5 years, he had learned to navigate the city's dark corners, finding the safest spots to sleep and scrounging for whatever scraps he could find. Life had beaten him down, but nothing had scared him as much as what he encountered one freezing December night. James had just found a place to rest, tucked behind a stack of old crates in a narrow alleyway that he thought no one else knew about. The walls were slick with grime, and the air reeked of mildew and garbage, but at least it was quiet. Or so he thought. As he settled down, pulling his tattered coat tighter around himself, he heard it, a faint, barely audible sound coming from further down the alley. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the more he listened, the more it sounded like a woman's voice, soft, weeping, almost in pain. Curiosity mixed with dread. He knew better than to get involved in someone else's problems on the streets. It was a dangerous game, but the sobbing didn't stop. It got louder, closer. James hesitated, but something about the sorrow in that voice drew him in. He got up and began walking slowly toward the sound, his footsteps barely making a noise on the wet pavement. As he rounded the corner, the narrow alley opened up slightly, and there she was, sitting with her back to him, her body slumped against the wall. The woman was wearing a dirty, torn dress, her hair matted and covering her face. Her shoulders shook with each ragged breath, her sobs echoing in the confined space. James's first instinct was to turn around and walk away, but something kept him rooted to the spot. He called out softly, "Are you okay?" No response. He took a step closer, his heart pounding. "Do you need help?" The woman stopped crying. Her entire body went still, as if she had been frozen in place. Slowly, painfully slowly, she turned her head to the side. The hair shifted, revealing part of her face. James's blood ran cold. Her skin was deathly pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were all wrong. They were wide, unblinking, and pitch black, as if they held no soul. Her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, one that spread unnaturally wide, revealing rows of decayed, sharp teeth. She stared at him, her head tilting slightly as if she was sizing him up. Then, in a voice that sounded both like a whisper and a scream at the same time, she said, "Stay." James stumbled backward, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to run, but his legs felt like lead. The woman slowly began to stand, her bones cracking with each movement. She was much taller than he had realized, her limbs impossibly long, almost spider-like. And then she moved. She didn't walk toward him. She glided. Her feet barely touched the ground, her long arms stretching out toward him. That smile never wavered. Her black eyes locked on his, filled with a hunger that he couldn't understand. But he knew one thing. She wasn't human. James turned and bolted down the alley, not daring to look back. But he could hear her behind him, that scraping, slithering sound of her body chasing him through the narrow streets. He sprinted faster than he ever had, weaving through alleyways and jumping over debris, but no matter how far he ran, the sound followed him, growing closer with each second. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he kept running until he burst out into the main street. The bright lights of passing cars and the hum of the city buzzed around him, but when he turned to look behind him, the alley was empty. There was no sign of the woman, no sign of the nightmare he had just escaped. Panting and drenched in sweat, James collapsed on the sidewalk, his mind spinning. People passed by him, giving him strange looks, but no one stopped. No one asked if he was okay. They couldn't hear her. They couldn't see what he had seen. For weeks after that night, James avoided the alleys altogether, choosing to sleep in crowded areas where he felt safer. But no matter where he went, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, watching him, waiting for him to be alone again. And sometimes, late at night, just as he was about to drift off to sleep, he would hear it. The soft sound of a woman weeping far in the distance, but always getting closer. The rain had been coming down for hours, turning the city streets into rivers of grime and filth. Kevin had been homeless for nearly 3 years, drifting from shelter to shelter, park bench to park bench. Tonight, though, he was stuck under a bridge on the edge of town, huddled in the cold. His soaked clothes clung to his skin, and the bitter wind cut through him like a knife. He had to find a place to sleep before hypothermia set in. but there was nowhere to go. The city seemed dead, abandoned by all but him. Then in the distance, through the haze of rain, Kevin saw a light, dim and flickering. At first he thought it was just a street lamp, but no, it was moving. It was a fire. Someone had made a camp. Desperate for warmth, Kevin pulled himself to his feet and began trudging toward it. The closer he got, the stranger the scene became. The fire wasn't in a typical homeless camp. It was in an old, abandoned building he'd never noticed before. Its windows were boarded up, and the walls were crumbling, as if the structure had been forgotten by time. Despite the eerie feeling creeping up his spine, Kevin moved closer, drawn to the fire's warmth. He entered through a gap in the broken door, the flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In front of the fire sat an old man, his face gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tightly over his skull. He wore a tattered coat, much like Kevin's, but his eyes were wrong. They were too wide, too dark, like twin black voids staring into nothing. The old man smiled, if you could call it that. His lips curled back unnaturally far, revealing teeth that were jagged and yellowed, as if they had been filed down to points. "Come, sit by the fire," the man said, his voice like gravel scraping against metal. Kevin hesitated, every instinct telling him to leave, but his body craved warmth. He slowly sat down across from the man, letting the fire's heat sink into his frozen bones. As he warmed up, the old man never stopped watching him, those dark eyes unblinking. "Been out here long?" Kevin asked, trying to make conversation, if only to fill the unsettling silence. The man didn't respond. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, and Kevin noticed something strange. There was no smoke coming from the fire. The flames danced and flickered, but there was no crackle of burning wood, no smell of smoke, just an unnatural dead heat. "Where did you find the wood?" Kevin asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man's grin widened. "The fire's always been here." Kevin felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. Something about this whole situation was wrong, deeply wrong. He looked around the room, hoping to see something, anything that would make sense. That's when he noticed the walls. What he had thought were just shadows cast by the fire weren't shadows at all. They were figures, vague, human shapes, but distorted, twisted. And they weren't standing still. They were moving, writhing, as if trying to escape from the walls themselves. Kevin's breath caught in his throat. He quickly turned back to the old man, but he was no longer sitting across from him. He was gone. Suddenly, the room felt colder, despite the fire still burning fiercely in front of him. Kevin scrambled to his feet, heart pounding in his chest, and stumbled toward the door. But as he reached the exit, something grabbed him. It wasn't the old man. No, this hand was colder, smoother. He looked down and saw a pale, skeletal arm reaching out from the wall, its fingers wrapped tightly around his wrist. Kevin screamed and tried to pull away, but the grip only tightened, dragging him back toward the wall. He thrashed, kicking and clawing at the air, but more arms emerged from the shadows, pulling at him, dragging him closer and closer to the wall. Kevin could feel the cold seeping into his skin, his vision blurring as his body was pulled inch by inch toward the inky blackness. The last thing Kevin saw before the darkness consumed him was the fire, the strange, silent fire that flickered without smoke. And just before the shadows swallowed him whole, he heard the old man's voice, faint and distant, whispering from somewhere deep in the black. "The fire's always been here." When Kevin's body was found a week later, no one could explain how he had ended up inside the old crumbling building, his face frozen in a twisted mask of terror. There were no signs of a fire. The police ruled it as exposure to the elements, another homeless man who had succumbed to the cold. But if you ask the few who still live under that bridge, they'll tell you a different story. They'll tell you about the strange fire, the shadows that move, and the old man with the jagged smile who's always watching, always waiting for someone new to sit by his fire.